The Great Hall of the Celestial Assembly did not merely house the representatives of the galaxy. It imprisoned them within the crushing weight of their own history. The chamber was a hollowed-out geode of continental proportions, suspended within the gravity well of a neutron star that served as both their timekeeper and their executioner. The walls, faceted with crystalline structures grown over millions of years, reflected the dim, pulsating violet light of the dying star outside, casting long, bruised shadows across the tiered seating where thousands of delegates sat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. The air tasted of ozone and ancient dust, recycled through filtration systems that had been humming since before the first mammal crawled from the mud on Earth. Here, the high academic Vale, the premier mind of the Krellian ascendancy and the galaxy's foremost authority on stellar mechanics, stood at the central podium. He was a creature of slender elegance, his chitinous exterior polished to the sheen of obsidian, his four eyes blinking in an alternating rhythm that betrayed his exhaustion. He looked up at the vast, holographic projection floating above the assembly, a simulation of a red giant star consuming its planetary children. The image was not theoretical, it was a live feed from the edge of the Perseus arm. Another system was going dark. Another civilization was extinguishing its lights, not because of war, but because they had run out of time. The energy crisis was not a sudden shortage. It was the slow, creeping heat death of their localized cluster, a puzzle that had defied the greatest minds of the assembly for 10,000 cycles. Vale adjusted the vocal amplifier at his throat, the device emitting a low, harmonious thrum that resonated through the crystal floor. "We are measuring the breaths of the dying," Vale began, his voice echoing with a melancholy that transcended species barriers. "The calculations are irrefutable. The extraction methods we have relied upon, orbital siphoning, geothermal tapping, localized fusion, are akin to drinking from a drying river with a thimble. We are civilizations built on the consumption of exponential power, yet our means of gathering that power remain linear, primitive, and fatally inefficient." He gestured with a long, darker-clawed hand toward the hologram. "The Council has asked me once again to review the theoretical constructs proposed by the younger races, specifically the concept of total stellar encasement, the so-called Dyson model." A ripple of murmurs moved through the tiers, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. The Dyson sphere was a myth, a ghost story of engineering that every fledgling species dreamed of and every elder species knew to be impossible. To build a shell around a star was to invite catastrophe. The material stress, the gravitational shear, and the sheer volume of mass required made it a fool's errand. Vale allowed the murmurs to subside before continuing, his tone hardening into the cold rigidity of absolute academic certainty. "I have spent my life studying the stress tensors of megastructures. I have watched the T-RAL Federation bankrupt 3-star systems attempting to build a rigid ring. I have seen the wreckage of the Velosian swarm, drifting as molten slag because they could not calculate the orbital drift of 1 billion autonomous units. The physics does not support it. A star is not a battery to be boxed. It is a chaotic, living fusion engine that breathes. To enclose it is to suffocate it, or to be incinerated by its rebellion. Therefore, I assert, with the full weight of the Academy behind me, that no species currently seated in this hall, nor any species we have yet encountered, possesses the discipline or the conceptual framework to solve the star energy puzzle. We are looking for a door where there is only a wall." The silence that followed was heavy with despair. The assembly had wanted hope, Vale had given them mathematics. He looked around the vast chamber, seeing the varied forms of the galactic elite, the gas-breathing hydrons in their suspended tanks, the lithoid golems of the deep core, the insectoid hive queens of the outer rim. All of them were powerful, ancient, and terrified. They had conquered hyperspace, they had manipulated genomes, they had ended plagues, but they could not solve the simple arithmetic of survival. They needed more energy than their stars could passively provide, and active harvesting was killing the very suns they relied upon. Vale felt a flicker of pity for them. He was the bearer of bad news, the scientist who refused to lie to the politicians. He prepared to step down, to retreat to his sanctum and document the end of the age, when the heavy, sealed doors at the far end of the geode groaned. The sound was unusual. The doors were only opened for new admissions, and no new species had achieved spaceflight capable of reaching the assembly coordinates. In 3 centuries, the low rumble of the mechanism vibrated through the floor, causing the violet light to shudder. Heads turned. Sensors swept the entrance. The great doors parted, grinding against the vacuum seals, and a small, unassuming delegation walked into the light. They walked on two legs, ungainly and soft-skinned, wrapped in simple, synthetic fabrics that offered little protection against the chill of the chamber. They wore no ceremonial armor, no psych amplifiers, no floating graviton crowns. They carried only simple data slates and a metallic, spherical device that floated between them on a magnetic tether. Humans. Vale narrowed his eyes. He had read the reports on humanity, a volatile, short-lived species from a yellow dwarf system in the chaotic Orion Spur. They were known for their contradictions, capable of immense art and horrific violence, prone to illogical emotional outbursts, yet surprisingly resilient. They had been granted observer status only a cycle ago, a charity gesture by the Council to placate the exploration guilds. That they would dare interrupt a session on the galactic crisis was not just arrogant, it was absurd. Vale remained at the podium, looking down at the approaching figures with a mix of curiosity and disdain. There were three of them. The leader, a woman with graying hair and eyes the color of steel, walked with a stride that suggested she was accustomed to gravity slightly heavier than the standard. She did not look up at the soaring architecture or the thousands of alien eyes watching her. She kept her gaze fixed on the podium, on Vale. The other two were younger, technicians by the look of their tools, their faces masks of concentrated anxiety. They stopped at the base of the central dais, dwarfed by the scale of the room. The woman bowed, a simple inclination of the head that was respectful but lacked the submissive curvature required by protocol. "High Academic Vale," she said, her voice amplified by a device on her collar. It was a calm voice, devoid of the trembling fear that usually accompanied lesser species when addressing the Ascendancy. "I am Dr. Aris Thorne, lead structural engineer for the Sol Coalition. We apologize for the interruption, but we believe the data you are presenting is incomplete." The audacity of the statement caused a shockwave of sound to erupt in the chamber. Several hydrant tanks bubbled furiously, their translation lights flashing red. A golem representative ground its tectonic plates together in a sound like an earthquake. Vale raised a hand, demanding silence. He looked down at the human, his mandibles clicking softly in amusement. "Incomplete," he repeated, tasting the word. "You are a child of a species that has barely mastered fusion, Dr. Thorne. You have been in the void for less time than I have been giving this lecture, and you claim that the accumulated knowledge of the Krellian Ascendancy, a civilization that mapped the black holes before your ancestors invented agriculture, is incomplete." Vale leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We are discussing the death of stars, little engineer. We are discussing the entropy of the cosmos. Go back to your seat and listen. You might learn how to die with dignity." Dr. Thorne did not flinch. She did not look at the angry crowd. She tapped the floating sphere beside her. "We are not here to discuss how to die," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "We are here to show you how we learn to live. You say the Dyson model is impossible because you view the star as an adversary. You see it as a beast to be caged. You are trying to build a wall around a nuclear explosion and wondering why the cement cracks." She signaled to her technicians. The floating sphere hummed, splitting open to reveal a complex emitter. "We didn't build a wall, we built a mirror, and we built a choir." Vale watched, intending to cut her off, but curiosity, the fatal flaw of all scientists, stayed his hand. "Proceed," he said, waving a claw dismissively. "Amuse us, show us your toy." Thorne nodded to her team. The emitter pulsed, and the massive hologram of the dying red giant above them was swept away, replaced by a projection of the Sol system. It was a chaotic, vibrant place. But what drew the eye was not the planets, but the star itself. It was not encased in a solid shell. It was not surrounded by a rigid ring. Instead, it was wreathed in a shifting, flowing cloud of gold and silver, billions of individual points of light, dancing in complex, non-repeating orbits. It looked like a veil of living dust, swirling around the sun in a pattern that mimicked the flow of water or the flocking of birds. It was beautiful, and it was impossible. "This," Thorne said, pointing to the shimmering cloud, "is the Sol Dyson swarm. It is not a structure in the architectural sense. There are no girders, no stress points, no rigid geometry to shatter under gravity. It is a fluid dynamic system. Comp. Host of 3 trillion autonomous collector satellites, each no larger than a house, communicating with its neighbors at light speed to adjust orbit, angle, and density." Vale stared. The simulation zoomed in. He saw the individual units, sleek mirrored sails unfurled to catch the solar wind, balancing radiation pressure against gravity. They didn't fight the star, they surfed it. When a solar flare erupted, the swarm didn't resist. It parted like a curtain in a breeze, allowing the destructive energy to pass through harmlessly, then closed again to capture the afterglow. It breathes, Vale whispered, the realization striking him with the force of a physical blow. You didn't build a cage, you gave the star a second skin. Thorne looked up, and for the first time she smiled. It was a tired, grim smile. We tried the rigid models, she said. We failed, we lost colonies, we broke our economy. We realized that your mathematics was correct, high academic. You cannot contain a star, but you don't have to. You just have to be lighter than the light. She tapped the slate. This system currently captures 84% of Sol's total output. We beam the excess to our outer colonies, but more importantly, the swarm does something else. It stabilizes the star. The assembly fell into a stunned silence. The concept of stellar stabilization was the holy grail of astrophysics. To keep a star from aging, to regulate its fusion rate, it was god-tier engineering. Explain, Vale demanded, his arrogance replaced by a ravenous hunger for data. How can a cloud of mirrors stabilize a fusion core? Thorne gestured, and the simulation changed to a cross-section of the sun. Magnetic feedback, she said simply. The swarm doesn't just collect energy. It acts as a massive, distributed induction coil. By adjusting the orientation of the mirrors, we can reflect a fraction of the star's own light back onto specific magnetic field lines. We can heat the corona or cool the photosphere. We can dampen the coronal mass ejections before they form. We are essentially performing acupuncture on a celestial body. We have extended Sol's lifespan by 4 billion years. The hall was silent for a long time. Then a single voice from the Hydran sector bubbled up. The energy, the output, what is the efficiency? Thorne looked at the alien. Total system efficiency is 99.4%. We have solved the energy puzzle. We have more power than we can use. We are offering the blueprint to the assembly. Vale stood frozen. He looked at the simulation, then at the small, fragile human standing before him. He had spent centuries telling the galaxy that this was impossible, that the energy crisis was an inevitable tragedy of thermodynamics. And here, a species that had barely left its cradle had proven him wrong, not by overpowering the laws of physics, but by dancing with them. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, humility. It was a rare and bitter taste. Why? Vale asked, his voice softer now. Why give this to us? You could hold the galaxy ransom. You could become the energy lords of the sector. Why bring it to the council that mocked you? Thorne's expression darkened. The triumph in her eyes faded, replaced by a deep, haunted shadow. She looked around the hall at the thousands of powerful beings who ruled the stars. Because the energy crisis isn't the real problem, she said quietly. It's just the symptom. We didn't build the swarm just to keep the lights on. We built it because when we started listening to the sun, we realized it was screaming. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from awe to cold dread. The high academic Vale stepped down from his podium, moving toward the humans. His height was imposing, nearly double that of Thorne, but she stood her ground. Screaming? Vale asked. Stars do not scream, Dr. Thorne. They emit radio waves, X-rays, thermal radiation. They are fusion reactors, not sentient beings. Thorne shook her head. That's what we thought. But when you surround a star with 3 trillion receivers, you don't just get power. You get the most sensitive radio telescope ever constructed. We turned the entire Sol system into an ear, and we heard the background noise of the universe. She tapped a command into her slate. The hologram of the swarm changed. The visual spectrum faded, replaced by a visualization of audio data, a chaotic, jagged waveform that pulsed with a rhythmic, unnatural beat. This is the signal we picked up 2 years ago, Thorne said. It's not random, it's not a pulsar, it's not a quasar. It's a signal embedded in the cosmic microwave background. It's everywhere. Every star in the galaxy is vibrating in response to it like a tuning fork. The energy drain you are seeing, the dying stars you are tracking, they aren't dying of old age. They are being drained. A gasp went through the assembly. The implication was horrific. Vale stared at the waveform he recognized. Pattern? It was a viral sequence, a dampening field of subspace interference that suppressed fusion reactions on a quantum level. Something is eating the stars, Vale whispered, the horror of the realization making his chitin rattle. Something vast, Thorne nodded. We call it the entropy tide. It's a subspace phenomenon, or perhaps an entity sweeping through the spiral arms. It feeds on high-energy reactions. That is why your rigid spheres failed. They created pressure cookers that attracted the tide. But the swarm, she pointed to the flowing cloud. The swarm is permeable. It disperses the signal. It hides the star from the tide's sensors. We didn't just solve the energy puzzle, high academic. We built a camouflage cloak for our sun. She looked at Vale, her eyes pleading. We are not here to sell you batteries. We are here to tell you that the dark is coming, and unless every system in this assembly adopts the swarm architecture, the lights will go out. Not in 1,000,000 years, in 100. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. The political squabbles, the trade disputes, the border wars, all of it rendered instantly meaningless. They were facing an extinction-level event on a galactic scale. The star energy puzzle that Vale had declared unsolvable was indeed a puzzle, but not of physics. It was a puzzle of survival against a predator they hadn't known existed. Vale looked at the humans with new eyes. He saw the exhaustion in their stance, the desperation. They had been carrying this secret, building their swarm, terrified that they were the only ones hearing the footsteps in the dark. They were not primitives, they were the sentinels. Vale turned back to the assembly. He saw the panic beginning to set in, the fear of the unknown. He knew that without leadership, this fear would turn to chaos. He had to be the bridge. He looked at Thorn. "The blueprint," he said. "Is it scalable? Can it be adapted to red giants, to binary systems?" "To the neutron star outside this chamber." "It is universal," Thorn replied. "The nanites are adaptive. They learn the star's rhythm, but we cannot build it for you. We don't have the resources. We have the design, the code, and the proof. You have the industrial capacity of 1,000 worlds. We need to work together. We need to turn this galaxy into a network of swarms, if we link them. If we link the telemetry of 1 billion stars." She trailed off, looking at the ceiling. "Then what?" Vale asked. "If we link them." Thorn's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then we don't just hide. We turn the network outward. We turn the galaxy into a weapon, a directed energy array of unprecedented scale. We can push the tide back." Vale felt a shiver run through his body that had nothing to do with the cold. The ambition of it was staggering. These humans, these short-lived, fragile creatures, proposed to turn the Milky Way into a single, cohesive organism to fight a cosmic horror. It was madness. It was brilliance. It was the only path forward. Vale ascended the podium again. He looked at the hologram of the Sol swarm, that beautiful, fluid dance of gold and silver. He looked at the data showing the stability, the power, the protection. He realized that his lecture on the impossibility of the task had been the final gasp of an old era. The era of static empires was over. The era of the fluid galaxy had begun. He activated the amplifier. The room fell silent, waiting for his judgment. "Representatives of the Assembly," Vale said, his voice ringing with a strength he hadn't felt in cycles. "For 10,000 years we have looked at the stars and seen resources. We have seen fuel. We have seen property. Today the Terran delegation has taught us that we were wrong. A star is not a resource. A star is a shield, and we have been letting our shields rust." He gestured to Thorn. "The Terran proposal is accepted, not for debate, not for committee review, for immediate implementation. We will mobilize the fleets. We will retool the shipyards. We will tear down our palaces if we have to build these mirrors." He looked down at Thorn, and for the first time in the history of the Assembly, a high academic bowed low to a species that had not yet earned its seat. "Teach us, Dr. Thorn. Teach us how to weave the light." The work began not with fanfare, but with the quiet, desperate intensity of survival. The Terran engineers were integrated into the highest levels of the Krellian academies. The blueprints were disseminated to the foundries of the golems and the biolabs of the hydrons. The galaxy became a construction site. There were frictions, of course. Cultural misunderstandings, logistical nightmares, the sheer terror of dismantling existing infrastructure to build the swarms. But the fear of the entropy tide, now confirmed by sensors in a dozen systems, drove them forward. The humans were the glue. They moved between species, translating not just language, but intent. We. Ray calm, pragmatic, and relentlessly optimistic. Where the ancient races saw insurmountable obstacles, the humans saw engineering challenges to be hacked. They introduced the concept of good enough, a terrifying notion to the perfectionist Krellians, but essential for the speed required. Months turned into years. The first swarms came online in the core systems. The effect was immediate. The localized subspace interference dropped. The stars stabilized. Energy output skyrocketed, ending the resource wars overnight. But the true test was yet to come. The tide was moving. It had been detected entering the Cygnus sector, a wave of dark energy that extinguished fusion reactions like a candle snuffed by fingers. The Cygnus stars were flickering. The assembly watched from the Great Hall, no longer a place of debate, but a war room. The hologram showed the encroaching darkness, a shadow swallowing the light. "The Cygnus swarm is only 40% operational," a Hydron technician reported, its voice synthesized and panicked. "It is not enough to hide the stars. The tide is locking on." Vale looked at Thorn. They stood side by side now, equals in the face of the end. Thorn was older, the stress had grayed her hair completely, but her eyes were still steel. "We don't hide them," Thorn said. "We link them, activate the Sol Cygnus bridge." Vale hesitated. "The phase variance is too high. If we link the telemetry of Sol to a system that unstable." "Do it," Thorne commanded. We feed them our stability, we lend them our rhythm. Vale nodded to the operators. Initiate synchronization. On the display, a line of light connected the Sol system to the beleaguered Cygnus sector. Across light years, the quantum entanglement communicators roared to life. The Sol swarm adjusted its orbit, pulsating in a specific rapid frequency. Moments later, the unfinished Cygnus swarm began to mimic the movement. The chaotic, dying stars of Cygnus were forced into harmonic resonance with Sol. The effect was like a heart restart. The Cygnus stars flared, their magnetic fields expanding violently. The incoming entropy tide hit the wall of coherent energy and shattered. The darkness recoiled. Cheers erupted in the hall, a cacophony of roars, chirps, and rumbles. For the first time, they had hurt the enemy. But the victory was short-lived. The tide adapted. It didn't retreat, it coalesced. The scattered pockets of dark energy merged into a spearhead aimed directly at the heart of the network, Sol. The enemy had realized where the conductor of this orchestra was standing. They are targeting Earth, Vale said, his voice cold. They are bypassing the outer systems. They are coming for the prime conductor. The room fell silent. Sol was the anchor. If Sol fell, the synchronization would break and the galaxy would go dark. Thorne looked at the simulation. The red arrow of the enemy fleet, if it could be called a fleet, was racing toward her home. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. Let them come, she said. Dr. Thorne, Vale asked. We must evacuate. We can move the command center to Krell Prime. Thorne shook her head. No, you don't understand. We anticipated this. We didn't just build a shield, Vale. I told you, we built a weapon. She turned to the assembly. All systems, full synchronization, target coordinates, Sol system, heliopause, focus all reflected output on the arrival vector. A murmur of confusion. You want us to fire at your own sun? A delegate asked. No, Thorne said. I want you to fire through it. The order went out. 1,000 stars, wreathed in their swarms, turned their mirrors. They didn't reflect their own light back into their suns this time. They directed it into the comms laser array, beaming terawatts of coherent energy across the galaxy, aiming at the relay stations that bounced the signal to Sol. It was a river of light, a galactic ley line of unimaginable power converging on the humble yellow dwarf star. The Sol swarm caught the incoming energy. The mirrors glowed white-hot. The nanites screamed under the thermal load. The space around Sol began to distort. The sheer density of the energy was warping gravity. The tide has arrived, the tactical officer shouted. Subspace breach at the edge of the Sol system. It is massive. On the screen, a rift tore open in the fabric of space. A void darker than black spilled out, a cloud of negation, a hungry silence that ate the light of the distant stars. It rushed toward the sun, a predator lunging for the throat. Thorne watched, her hand gripping the console. Hold, she whispered. Let it get close. The darkness swept past Pluto, past Neptune. It swallowed the gas giants. It was an inevitability. Now, Thorne said, unfurl. The Sol swarm changed shape. The sphere dissolved. The trillions of mirrors realigned in a single second, forming a massive parabolic dish behind the sun. They didn't block the sun's light. They caught the incoming galact. Ike beamed from the 1,000 other stars, combined it with Sol's own fury, and focused it all through the lens of the sun's corona. The sun acted as a magnifier. A beam of pure, concentrated stellar fury, boosted by the power of a united galaxy, erupted from the Sol system. It was a lance of light so bright it cast shadows on planets 100 light-years away. It struck the entropy tide head-on. There was no sound in space, but every sensor in the hall registered the scream of the enemy. The dark matter boiled. The negation field was overwhelmed by the sheer brute force of creation. The beam didn't just burn the enemy, it rewrote the physics of the local space, imposing order on the chaos. The tide shattered, dissolving into harmless background radiation. The rift collapsed. The beam faded, leaving the Sol system ringing like a bell, but intact. The swarm dispersed, returning to its protective cloud formation, glowing dull red from the heat. Silence returned to the Great Hall, but it was not the silence of the grave as it had been years ago. It was the silence of awe. Vale looked at the screen, then at Thorne. The human was trembling, tears streaming down her face. It was done. The impossible puzzle had been solved. The enemy had been broken. Vale keyed his microphone. The star energy puzzle, he said, his voice thick with emotion, has been solved. The solution was not a machine. The solution was us. He turned to the human delegation. The Krellian Ascendancy formally withdraws its claim to leadership of the Scientific Council. We nominate the Terran Coalition as the Guardians of the Light. The motion was seconded by the Hydrons, then the Golems, then the Hive Queens. A roar of approval shook the crystalline walls. Later, as the celebrations raged across the station, Vale found Thorne standing on a viewing balcony looking out at the neutron star. The violent violet light was softer now, filtered through the new swarm that was already under construction around it. "You knew," Vale said, standing beside her. "You knew the tide would come for you." Thorne nodded. "We suspected. Predators always go for the heart." "You risked your entire species," Vale said, "if the lens hadn't worked." "Then we would have died in the light," Thorne said simply. "Better than dying in the dark." Vale looked at her, at the fragile biology that housed such terrifying resolve. "You humans," he mused. "You are a paradox. You are so small, yet you build such large things. You are so afraid of the dark, yet you charge into it." Thorne smiled, looking at the construction drones weaving the silver threads around the neutron star. "We have a saying on Earth, Professor. Do not go gentle into that good night. We've been fighting the night since we lived in caves. This," she gestured to the galaxy, now stitching itself together with threads of light. "This is just a bigger fire." Vale looked out at the galaxy. It looked different now. It was no longer a collection of isolated islands of light separated by vast, cold oceans. It was a network, a web, a nervous system. The humans had not just solved the energy crisis, they had awakened the galaxy. They had turned the universe into a community, and at the center of it, the small, yellow sun of Sol beat like a steady, defiant heart pumping life into the veins of the cosmos. "A bigger fire," Vale repeated. "Yes. I suppose it is." He looked at the human, feeling a sense of brotherhood he had never expected. "And I suppose," he added, "that now we must tend it together." Thorne turned to him and extended her hand. Vale looked at it, the soft, pink flesh against his hard, black chitin. He hesitated only a moment before clasping it. "Together," she agreed. "Class is in session, Professor." The two of them stood there, silhouetted against the birth of a new age, while above them the stars hummed a new song, a song of unity, of power, and of a light that would never, ever go out. The puzzle was finished. The picture was clear, and it was magnificent. The archival records of that day would simply state that the Dyson era began with a handshake. But those who were there knew the truth. It began when a human dared to tell a room full of gods that they were thinking too small. It began with the audacity to believe that the universe was not a tomb, but a home. And as the Krellian ships moved into position to assist the Terran engineers in the Cygnus sector, and the Hydran biological fabricators began growing the living lattice for the nebula swarms, a signal propagated through the newly established stellar network. It was a simple message, broadcast from Earth to the edge of the void, a warning to any other shadows that might be watching from the deep dark. It was a recording of the sun, amplified, harmonized, and translated into every known language. It said, "We are here, we are awake, and we are not alone." Deep in the void, beyond the reach of the swarms, things that slithered in the enter. Uppy recoiled. The galaxy, once a buffet of dying embers, had become a fortress of blinding radiance. The humans had done the one thing the darkness could not abide. They had turned on the lights, and in the glow of 100 billion stabilized stars, the civilizations of the Milky Way looked at each other and finally saw, for the first time, that they were all made of the same stardust. The energy crisis was over. The era of light had begun. And the professor, once the skeptic, now sat in his academy writing the first chapter of the new textbook. The title was simple, The Human Variable, How to Ignite a Galaxy. He smiled, dipped his stylus, and began to write. The story was far from over, he knew. In fact, he suspected, looking at the impossible, beautiful diagrams of the swarm, that it was only just beginning. The universe was vast, and there were other puzzles to solve. But now they had the power to solve them. Now they had the humans, and that, Vale decided, was the most efficient energy source of all. The great hall remained, but the shadows were gone. Light flooded every corner, reflected by the crystals, amplified by the hope that now permeated the very air. The delegates spoke not of endings, but of beginnings. Plans were drawn for intergalactic bridges, for expeditions to the satellite galaxies, for piercing the veil of the central black hole. The fear was gone, burned away by the brilliance of the solution. Humanity had not just saved them, it had elevated them. It had shown them that the laws of physics were not chains, but tools. And as the first transgalactic data stream came online, carrying the art, music, and science of 1,000 worlds along the beams of the swarms, the galaxy did not just survive. It sang. It sang with the voice of the Sol Dyson sphere, a melody of gold and silver, a lullaby for the fearful and a war cry against the dark. The human epic was here, and it was blindingly bright.